The guy who was now in charge of running Parliament was named Charles Townshend. And so it fell on him to come up with a solution for the need for money. And after consulting with Ben Franklin, he came up with what were called the Townshend duties. Or duty is another word for a tariff. It would be a tax on imports, which he understood to be, in Franklin's terms, an external tax, what economists call an indirect tax, and thus acceptable. Because he said that Americans would accept that as they did the Sugar Act, and that way we'll get some money. So he imposed tariffs, Townshend duties, on 5 products that Americans imported, and now they're going to pay an import tax on it, they're going to pay a tariff on it. The 5 items were paper, lead, glass, paint, and tea. Now if you think about those 5 items, 4 of them sort of fall into the category of manufactured products. They're the kind of things that Americans didn't produce for themselves. We don't have lead mines, we don't have paper mills, we're farmers. We import lead, paper, paint, and glass, and actually lead is kind of key because lead is an ingredient of the way they made paper, glass, and paint in those days. So those are 5 products that we import from England. Tea is a little bit different. Tea was not produced in England itself. Tea was actually grown in Asia. It's different places in Asia. So England has plantations in Asia where they're growing tea, and then it's imported by a company that's a British company, an English company that's been around forever, called the East India Company. And it's one of the big companies of England with a charter, just like the Virginia Company. But it had a monopoly of trade with Asia. By law, only the East India Company could trade between England and Asia. So tea is grown in Asia, it's imported to England, and then merchants in England import that. Well, it's the East India Company. They then re-export it to other parts of the empire. And that's not going to be taxed. Well, in fact, Americans really didn't get their tea from the East India Company. Americans got their tea in a way that I talked about earlier, that they got a lot of stuff. They smuggled it. They smuggled tea in from the other parts of the Caribbean, the West Indies, specifically the Dutch, because the Dutch also grew tea in Asia. They had plantations in Asia. Most of what were in what is now Indonesia, the modern nation of Indonesia, was mostly a Dutch colony in those days. So the Dutch would grow tea in Indonesia, in Dutch Asia, import it into the Netherlands, sell it there to the Netherlands West Indies, and the Americans did a lot of illegal trading with the Dutch West Indies. And among other things, that's where we got most of our sugar, or most of our tea. We get our tea from the Dutch. It was grown in Asia, but makes its way to America, and that's the way we got our tea. So although it's taxed as part of the Townshend duties, it's not really going to be much of an issue because we don't really get much tea from the East India Company, the legal tea. We get our smuggled tea. Well, Townshend had understood that this is going to work because he believed, based on advice he was getting from Franklin and other Americans, that this would work, that Americans would accept tariffs as external taxes, just not internal taxes like the Stamp Act. Well, he was wrong. Poor Charlie. Either Franklin didn't quite understand what was going on and really misinformed him, or the Americans had changed their mind. If they had made a distinction between internal and external taxes, they no longer did. Now they're saying a tax is a tax. End of story. So once again, the mobs take to the streets. Once again, merchants get together, American merchants, and agree to boycott English products. There were a lot of American merchants who would not go along with the boycott, and then the mob would come out and trash their building, trash their business, trash them. So the mobs are just running amok in America. And although the poor tax collectors, they did collect some revenue, the Townsend duties produced more revenue than the Stamp Act had. Well, the Stamp Act produced zero revenue. So there was some revenue collected, but it was always very limited. There was a certain amount of smuggling of other products. Of course, tea had always been smuggled, and so tea continued to be smuggled. And any merchant who tried to import paint, lead, glass, or paper, or tea, any of the products, it would sort of have to smuggle it in, because if he got caught paying the taxes legally, here comes the mob. So this is just not working well. This goes on for a couple of years, and the struggling is there. And meanwhile, with all of this violence going on in America, England has established troops in America. They've taken some of the soldiers that were in forts in the West to protect us against Indians. They're not having any problems with Indians. They're having problems with American mobs. So they moved some troops to America, especially to Boston. And Boston is where the violence against the Townsend duties is the most extreme. There's violence everywhere. There's mobs throughout the colonies. But their most active and the most severe resistance is in Boston. And I think there are two reasons for that. One was that Boston was the home of probably the most successful agitator, the most active organizer, the most outspoken opponent of the thing, a man named Sam Adams. And Sam Adams was from a fairly respectable family in Boston. He had some relatives who were prominent in the assembly. He was a member of the assembly himself at one time or another. His cousin John was also a very prominent attorney in Boston. Sam Adams was technically an attorney, but he was kind of the black sheep of his family, because most attorneys represent successful merchants, charge a lot of money, and become very wealthy themselves because they have rich clients, so they become rich. Well, Sam Adams was a little bit different. His clients tended to be working people. He'd defend working class people who would have legal disputes with their landlords or their boss or their wife or whatever. So he's got clients who are poor, so he was kind of poor himself. He wasn't as wealthy as his cousin John. But he had good ties with the working class. He had good ties with the ordinary laborers of Boston, the people who were doing much of the mob activity. He was very close to some of the leaders of the mob. He was working with them and organizing them and active in this. And he was in Boston, so that's why Boston is sort of the center of the most extreme resistance to the British taxation. The other reason was that that's where the headquarters of the tax service was. The British government agency that was overseeing the taxes and was responsible for administering the tax laws, that agency, which I'll talk about more a little bit later, that agency was located in Boston. They had their offices in a building in downtown Boston, which is still there. It's today called the Old State House, and that was where the offices of the whole colonial tax enforcement administration was. So there were a lot of riots outside those buildings, or that building. One morning, on March 5th, 1770, the law's been on the books now for about 3 years, There's one of the violent acts that happens all the time. This is a regular event in Boston, are mob riots protesting against the taxes. And the mob is out there as usual. And the British Army stationed in Boston is assigned to provide security for that building. And so there's about 8 soldiers who come in when the mob forms to take charge of protecting the building and its employees. Normally there were 2 soldiers there as security guards. The soldiers, when the mob forms, they say, wait a minute, this mob is really big. They send word to headquarters, Army headquarters in Boston, to send out some reinforcements. So an officer with 8 soldiers comes out to provide additional support to protect against the mob. And things get out of control. For some reason, one of the British soldiers fired his gun at the mob. He had had orders not to fire. The officer, when he heard this gun go off, came up to him and angrily said, "Why did you fire?" He had been ordered not to fire. Why did you fire? Well, you think about it a little bit, you can imagine the other soldiers heard that word, that phrase, and the only word they heard was fire. So then the whole group of them shot into the mob. And the result was, well, 3 members of the mob were killed that night. 2 of them died from their wounds the next morning. 5 people were killed in this event. Well, it was a tragedy. It was a situation where there was a mob scene, there was chaos. The officer couldn't keep control of his troops. He's telling them not to fire, but they did because he's not able to control them because the mob is around. So there's a couple hundred people there throwing rocks, throwing snowballs at the soldiers, calling them dirty names. It's just a breakdown of any kind of order, and in the chaos, 5 people got killed. The soldiers were later tried and for killing 5 people. They were tried before a Boston jury. They had, as attorney, they had John Adams, the cousin of Sam, who was one of the leading attorneys of Boston. He acted as their defense attorney, and they were all acquitted. Even a Boston jury found that they had not violated the law under the circumstances, that their firing their guns was justified because they were protecting themselves against a mob. But Sam Adams used this incident for propaganda purposes. He called it the Boston Massacre. And he wrote pamphlets and brochures and literature attacking Britain and claiming that the British troops had fired voluntarily and deliberately to kill innocent American working people, the mob, and made a big deal about the Boston Massacre. One of the guys who was working with him was actually a silversmith, but an artist, named Paul Revere. Revere did an etching of this incident, which appears in your textbook. You can look for it in your textbook and find the famous painting of the Boston Massacre, completed by Paul Revere as sort of a partner of Sam Adams, or there's a group of Americans working against this. And so that you can see that famous etching is totally false. It's a complete falsification of what actually happened in the massacre. It shows the soldiers firing on command of the officer. And the problem was that the officer did not give a command. The problem was that the officer lost control of his men, and they shot without his knowledge or permission. So it's complete fabrication, but it's part of a propagandistic attack on the British, on the army, on the redcoats, and indeed the English government. And what Sam Adams and Paul Revere and their other friends are trying to do is to promote an idea that the American colonies should become independent. Well, at the time, they have virtually no support. Very few Americans were ready to take the step of declaring independence from England. They don't like Parliament. They think Parliament is abusing their rights. So there's a lot of hostility to Parliament. But Americans think of themselves as loyal British subjects, which means that they are loyal to their king. The king had always been sort of the symbol of the English Empire, and Americans had always accepted that they were good, loyal British subjects with a British king, and they loved their king, and they considered themselves fortunate. They consider themselves the luckiest people in the Western Hemisphere because they have the English king. They're not like, as I said, those poor slobs in the French and the Spanish colonies who have royal absolutist kings and who give them no rights. So they love their king. Well, what's not to love? He mostly left them alone. Salutary neglect. He let them do their own thing. He let them have their assemblies, let them govern themselves, and all they have to do is, say, hey, God save the king, and we love you, Your Honor, Your Majesty. As it happened, while the war was going on, the king who was on the throne at the time that the 7 Years' War began was King George II. And then in 1760, when the war was halfway through, King George II died. He was replaced by, of all things, his grandson. It was a little bit unusual because the son of King George II, who was the father of George III, he had died early. He had died before his dad. So when King James, I'll get it right, King George II died, then the throne passed to his grandson, King George III. And George III was a young man because he was the grandson when he became king. And when he became king, there were celebrations of his throning, of his crowning throughout the British Empire. And most people say that the most glorious celebrations were in his American colonies. Americans just loved their king and considered themselves loyal to him. And so they'd have problems with Parliament, but not with the king. Well, the Boston Massacre was really a tragedy because, ironically, a few days before it took place, Parliament had indeed repealed the Townshend duties. After 3 years of struggles, after 3 years of fighting and riots and so forth, again they decided it's not worth it. So we'll repeal the acts. But again, they don't want to be seen as giving in to the American arguments. They won't accept the idea that they don't have the right to tax the Americans. So they left one of the Townshend duties in effect. Of the 5 articles that applied, they repealed the tax on 4 of them, but they kept the tax on the first one, on the one of them, tea. But that's a non-measure because Americans don't import tea anyway. So there's a law in the books. It's just there as a symbol of Parliament's power. So the Townshend Acts were repealed and the mobs stopped. Peace was restored to the British colonies of North America. What will change that? We'll find out in our next lecture.